Jake Morrison stood at the front window of his ship and watched the alien craft come closer. His hands were tight on the metal rail in front of him. The ship outside looked like a giant bug with wings made of dark metal and lights that pulsed like a heartbeat. He had seen ships just like this one before, 30 years ago when they came to kill every human they could find. The bridge around him was quiet except for the soft hum of computers and the breathing of his crew. Dr. Lisa Carter stood behind him looking at her data pad. She was reading about the Valkyrie, the bug-like aliens who were coming to visit them today. Lisa had been just a child during the war, but she had studied everything about these creatures for her entire adult life. "Commander, their ship is asking permission to dock with us," said the communications officer. Her name was Janet Mills and she sounded nervous. Everyone on the ship was nervous today. No human had talked to a Valkyrie in 15 years, not since the peace treaty was signed. Jake turned around to look at his crew. There were 12 people on the bridge, and every one of them had lost someone during the war. His own wife and daughter had died when the Valkyrie attacked Earth Colony 7. He still remembered the day he got the news. The message had been short and cold. Colony 7 destroyed. No survivors found. "Tell them they can dock at Port 3, Jake said. His voice was steady, but inside his chest his heart was beating fast. "Have security teams ready, but tell them to stay hidden. We don't want to start another war." Lisa walked over to stand next to him. She was a small woman with brown hair and kind eyes. "Jake, do you really think they're here to ask for our help?" she asked quietly. "I don't know what to think," Jake replied. 30 years ago they called us weak. They said humans were nothing more than soft animals that should be removed from the galaxy. Now they send a message saying they need to talk to us about something important. The Valkyrie ship connected to their vessel with a loud clang that echoed through the walls. Jake could hear the airlock doors opening and closing. Soon the aliens would be walking through his ship. He tried not to think about the last time he had seen a Valkyrie up close. Captain Ben Torres walked onto the bridge. He was an older man with gray hair and scars on his face from the war. Ben had been a soldier back then, fighting on the ground while Jake fought in space. "The aliens are here," Ben said. 3 of them. "They're walking to meeting room 2 right now." Jake nodded. "How do they look?" "Same as always. 8 feet tall, 6 arms, faces like giant insects. The leader has those blue markings on its shell that mean it can speak for its hive. They're not carrying weapons, but you know they don't need weapons to be dangerous." Everyone on the bridge knew what Ben meant. The Valkyrie had natural weapons built into their bodies. Their hands ended in claws that could cut through metal. Their mouths had sharp parts that could bite through bone. During the war, human soldiers had learned to fear the sound of Valkyrie claws clicking on metal floors. "I'll go meet with them," Jake said. "Lisa, Ben, come with me. Janet, keep monitoring their ship. If anything looks wrong, call for help immediately." The 3 humans walked through the corridors of their ship toward the meeting room. Jake remembered when these same hallways had been filled with wounded soldiers and refugees fleeing from Valkyrie attacks. The walls still had some marks from those days, places where laser fire had burned the metal, or where desperate people had scratched messages to their families. They reached the meeting room, and Jake took a deep breath before opening the door. Inside, 3 Valkyrie were waiting. The largest one stood in the center while the other 2 stayed near the walls. Their insect-like faces were impossible to read, but Jake could see the blue markings that Ben had mentioned. In Valkyrie culture, these markings meant the creature could make decisions for thousands of other Valkyrie. "I am Hive Speaker Zexhai," the largest alien said. Its voice sounded like metal scraping against stone. "I speak for the southern hives of Zephyria Prime. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." Jake sat down at the table but kept his hands where the aliens could see them. "I'm Commander Jake Morrison. This is Dr. Lisa Carter and Captain Ben Torres. Your message said you needed to discuss something important." The alien leader made a sound that might have been a sigh. "Commander Morrison, what I'm about to tell you may be difficult to believe. For the first time in the history of our species, we need help. Our young are dying and we cannot stop it." Lisa leaned forward. "What do you mean they're dying?" "Something is killing our larvae," Zexhai explained. "They become sick and fade away like shadows. Our best scientists cannot find the cause. Our most advanced medicine cannot cure them. We have lost thousands of young ones in the past 6 months." Ben made a harsh sound. "And you think we should care about your children dying? You killed plenty of ours during the war. The Velkari leader's head turned toward Ben. You are correct, Captain Torres. We did kill many human young during our conflict. We believed it was necessary for our survival. We were wrong about many things back then. Jake studied the alien's face. The Velkari had never admitted to being wrong about anything before. During the war, they had always claimed that humans were inferior, and that the galaxy would be better without them. Why come to us? Jake asked. You have technology that's far beyond ours. You have allies among other alien species. Because, Zexai said slowly, we believe that humans may be the only species capable of understanding what is hunting our young. You are the only ones who have ever fought against impossible odds and found a way to survive. You are the only ones who refused to surrender even when defeat seemed certain. The room was quiet for a long moment. Jake could hear the soft humming of the ship's engines and the quiet breathing of everyone present. He thought about his wife and daughter, about all the humans who had died during the war. He thought about the Velkari soldiers who had shown no mercy to human families. What exactly are you asking us to do? Jake finally said. Come to our homeworld, Zexai replied. Help us find what is killing our children. Help us stop it before our entire species faces extinction. Lisa spoke up. You're asking us to save the very species that tried to destroy us. Yes, the alien leader said simply. That is exactly what we are asking. Dr. Amy Rodriguez knelt beside the Velkari larva and tried not to show the horror she felt. The young alien was barely alive, its once bright shell now dull and gray like old metal. Through her medical scanner, she could see that something was eating the creature from the inside, but her instruments could not tell her what it was. How long has this one been sick? She asked the Velkari nurse who stood nearby. The nurse was smaller than the warriors Amy had seen before, with gentler movements and softer colors on her shell. 3 days, the nurse replied in broken human language. It started like the others. First, the young one stopped eating. Then it became quiet and would not play. Now it fades like smoke in the wind. Amy looked around the medical center where they were working. The building was huge and filled with advanced Velkari technology that made human medicine look simple by comparison. Machines hummed and blinked with lights that could analyze a patient down to the smallest parts of their body. Yet none of this amazing technology could explain what was happening to the Velkari young. Chris Baker walked over from where he had been working with Velkari scientists at a bank of computers. He was a tech specialist who had volunteered for this mission, despite having fought against the Velkari during the war. Amy, you need to see this data, he said quietly. She followed him to the computers where charts and numbers filled several screens. The Velkari scientist working with Chris was named Techmore, and he had been trying to find patterns in how the sickness spread. Look at these readings, Chris said, pointing to one of the screens. The larva's brain activity is dropping steadily, but not because it's dying naturally. Something is draining it. Amy studied the charts. In human medicine, she had seen many diseases that affected brain function, but nothing like this. It's like something is feeding on their thoughts, she said. Techmore made a clicking sound that meant agreement. That is what we fear as well, Dr. Rodriguez. Our young have very active minds, even more so than adult Velkari. If something is feeding on mental energy, they would be perfect targets. Kelly Price appeared in the doorway of the medical center. She was a field agent who had been investigating the areas where the sickness first appeared. Her face was grim, and she motioned for Amy and Chris to follow her outside. They walked through the Velkari city toward the residential area where families lived. The streets were quieter than Amy had expected. During the war, human intelligence had described Velkari cities as busy places full of noise and activity. Now many of the buildings looked empty, and the few Velkari they saw moved slowly with their heads down. I've been talking to families in this area, Kelly said as they walked. The pattern is always the same. A young Velkari goes to sleep healthy and wakes up sick. No warning signs, no exposure to anything unusual. It's like something visits them in the night. They reached a residential building where a Velkari family lived. The mother came out to meet them, and Amy could see the fear in her large compound eyes. Through the translator device, the mother explained that her youngest child had become sick just 2 days ago. Can we see the child's room? Kelly asked. The mother led them inside the building. Velkari homes were different from human houses, with curved walls and spaces designed for beings who could climb on ceilings. The child's room was small and filled with toys that looked like miniature versions of Velkari technology. Chris pulled out his scanning equipment and began taking readings around the room. "There's something strange here," he said after a few minutes. "The electromagnetic field is different from the rest of the building. It's like something was here that doesn't belong in our normal space." Amy examined the sick child, another larva that was fading just like the one at the medical center. As she worked, she noticed something that made her stop and think. "Kelly, ask the mother if she noticed anything unusual about the child's dreams before it got sick." Kelly spoke with the mother through the translator. After a moment, she turned back to Amy with a puzzled expression. "She says the child had very vivid dreams for several nights before getting sick. Dreams about flying through space and seeing colors that don't exist. She thought it was just normal for young Velkari to have active imaginations." "That's not normal," Techmore said. He had followed them to the house and was listening to their conversation. "Velkari larvae have structured thought patterns. We do not dream in the way humans do. If this child was having vivid dreams, something was affecting its mind." Chris continued scanning the room with his equipment. "I'm picking up traces of exotic particles," he said. "They're not from any known technology, and they seem to phase in and out of normal spacetime. Whatever was here exists partially in another dimension." Amy felt a chill run down her spine. During her medical training, she had studied reports from human colonies that had been attacked by unknown entities during the early days of space exploration. Most of those reports had been classified as impossible, but now she wondered if they had been more real than anyone believed. They left the family's home and walked back toward the city center where the human team was staying. Jake Morrison and Ben Torres were waiting for them in the command post that had been set up in a Velkari government building. "What did you find?" Jake asked as soon as they entered the room. "Something that shouldn't exist," Amy replied. "The Velkari young aren't dying from any disease or poison. Something is feeding on their minds, draining their mental energy until there's nothing left." Ben leaned forward in his chair. "You're talking about some kind of psychic vampire." "I know how it sounds," Amy said, "but the evidence supports it. The victims all report unusual dreams before getting sick." Chris detected exotic particles that exist partially outside normal space, and the brain scans show a pattern of energy being drained rather than cells being damaged. Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about what he had heard. "During the war, did we ever encounter anything like this?" he asked Ben. "Not that I remember," Ben replied, "but there were some classified reports about strange incidents on the outer colonies. Whole settlements would go quiet, and when rescue teams arrived, they'd find everyone alive but mentally empty. Like someone had taken their minds and left their bodies behind." Kelly spoke up. "I think we're dealing with something that's been hunting intelligent species for a long time. The Velkari just happened to develop young with very active minds, making them perfect prey." Chris was looking at his data again. "There's something else," he said. "According to the Velkari records, this problem started about 6 months ago. That's right around the time they began developing new biotechnology that enhanced their children's mental abilities." Techmore made a worried clicking sound. "You believe our own improvements to our young made them more attractive to this entity?" "It's possible," Amy said. "If something feeds on mental energy, then enhancing a child's brain power would be like ringing a dinner bell." Jake stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the Velkari city. In the distance, he could see other residential buildings where families were probably watching their children fade away. "So we have an entity that feeds on minds, exists partially outside normal space, and is attracted to intelligent young beings. How do we fight something like that?" "That's what we need to figure out," Amy replied. "But first we need to understand more about how it hunts and why it chose the Velkari." Ben made a harsh laugh. 30 years ago, we were fighting these aliens with everything we had. Now we're trying to save their children from something worse than we ever were." "The universe has a sense of irony," Kelly said quietly. Jake turned back to his team. "Whatever this thing is, it's killing innocent children. That makes it our enemy regardless of what species those children belong to. We're going to find a way to stop it." Dr. Steve Murphy crawled through the narrow tunnel deep inside the ancient structure they had found floating in space. His headlamp cut through the darkness ahead of him, revealing walls covered with symbols that hurt his eyes to look at directly. The structure was old, older than any known civilization in the galaxy, and it seemed to exist in several dimensions at once. "Are you getting readings on those symbols?" Dr. Nina Bell called from behind him. She was a historian who specialized in dead alien cultures, and she had insisted on coming into the structure despite the danger. Her scanner was picking up energy patterns that made no sense according to human science. The symbols are definitely artificial, Steve replied, stopping to examine a section of wall more closely. But they're not carved or painted. It's like they exist in the wall material itself, part of the atomic structure. Whoever built this place had technology beyond anything we've seen. They emerged from the tunnel into a large chamber, filled with floating platforms and walls covered in the strange symbols. The air in the chamber felt thick and wrong, like it was made of something other than normal gases. Both humans had to wear special breathing equipment because the atmosphere inside the structure was toxic to most known life forms. "Look at this," Nina said, pointing her scanner at one wall. "The symbols are telling a story. It's fragmented and the language is unlike anything in our databases, but I can make out some basic concepts. Hunger, consumption, worlds going dark." Roy Clark's voice crackled over their communicators from where he waited in their ship outside the structure. "You two need to see this. I'm picking up massive energy signatures from deeper in that thing. Whatever's in there, it's waking up." Steve and Nina moved carefully through the chamber toward an opening that led deeper into the structure. The symbols on the walls were glowing brighter now, and the air itself seemed to pulse with a rhythm like a giant heartbeat. They followed a corridor that twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible, sometimes walking on the walls or ceiling without feeling any change in gravity. "Steve, I'm translating more of the symbols," Nina said as they walked. "This place is some kind of archive or warning system. The builders called the entity the Shadow Hunger. According to this, it feeds on potential energy from developing minds." They reached another chamber, this one much larger than the first. In the center was a device that looked like a mixture of organic tissue and crystalline technology. It was pulsing with the same rhythm they had felt throughout the structure, and streams of data flowed across its surface in languages that predated known civilization. "This is incredible," Steve said, approaching the device carefully. "It's some kind of recording system. The builders documented their encounter with the Shadow Hunger before their civilization fell." Nina worked with her translation equipment, trying to decode the information flowing across the device. "According to these records, the Shadow Hunger has destroyed dozens of civilizations over millions of years. It always follows the same pattern. It finds species with highly developed young minds and feeds on their potential until the entire race goes extinct." "How did the builders of this place survive long enough to create this archive?" Steve asked. "They didn't," Nina replied grimly. "These are the last records of their species. They built this place as a warning for anyone who might encounter the entity after them." Roy's voice came over the communicator again, more urgent this time. "Something's happening out here. I'm detecting movement in space around the structure. It looks like the entity is responding to your presence in there." Steve felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air in the chamber. "Nina, can you download those records quickly? I think we need to leave." "Almost done," she said, connecting her equipment to the alien device. "Steve, there's something else here. The records mention that chaotic thought patterns can interfere with the entity's feeding process. Most advanced civilizations develop ordered, logical thinking that makes them easier prey. But species with unpredictable, chaotic minds are harder for it to consume. Chaotic minds like humans have," Steve realized. "Exactly. During the war with the Velkari, human unpredictability was one of our greatest advantages. We made decisions that no logical species would make, and it confused them. The same trait might be what we need to fight the Shadow Hunger." The structure around them began to vibrate and the symbols on the walls pulsed faster. Through the walls they could hear something that sounded like whispers in a language that was older than stars. "Roy, start the engines," Steve called into his communicator. "We're coming out now." They ran through the twisting corridors as the structure shook around them. The symbols on the walls were now blazing with light, and the whispers had become screams that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Behind them, something was following, something that existed more in thought than in physical space. They reached their ship and Roy had the engines running before they were fully aboard. As they pulled away from the ancient structure, Steve looked back to see it dissolving into nothingness, as if it had only existed because someone was there to observe it. "Did you get the data?" Roy asked as he piloted their ship away from the area. "Everything we could download," Nina replied, "and it's not good news. This entity has been hunting intelligent species for millions of years. It's patient, intelligent, and nearly impossible to fight using conventional methods." Back on Zephyria Prime, they met with Jake Morrison and the rest of the human team in the command center. The Velkari leaders, including Hive speaker Zexhai, were also present to hear what they had learned. The shadow hunger isn't just some mindless predator, Steve explained, showing them the translated data. It's ancient, intelligent, and it's done this countless times before. It finds a species with developed young minds and feeds on them until the entire civilization collapses. Nina added, but there's hope. The entity has trouble feeding on chaotic, unpredictable thought patterns. Human minds, with our tendency toward irrational decisions and creative thinking, create interference that makes us harder to consume. Zexhai made a sound of understanding. This explains why our young are such perfect prey. Velkari larvae are taught to think in ordered, logical patterns from the moment they hatch. We have bred chaos out of our minds over thousands of years. So what do we do with this information? Asked Amy Rodriguez. Jake looked at the data on the screens around them. We use human chaos as a weapon. If our unpredictable thinking can interfere with the entity's feeding, then maybe we can use that interference to protect the Velkari young. You're talking about humans forming some kind of mental link with alien children, Ben Torres said. That's dangerous territory. We don't know what that kind of connection might do to either species. The alternative is watching an entire species go extinct, Jake replied. The Velkari may have been our enemies during the war, but their children are innocent. And if the shadow hunger finishes with them, what's to stop it from coming after human children next? Chris Baker had been studying the technical data from the ancient archive. There's something else we need to consider. According to these records, the entity gets stronger with each feeding. The more minds it consumes, the more powerful it becomes. If we don't stop it here, it might become impossible to stop anywhere. The room was quiet as everyone thought about the implications. They were facing an enemy that had destroyed civilizations across the galaxy, and their only weapon was the chaotic nature of human thought. How do we even begin to form mental links with Velkari larvae? Kelly Price asked. Very carefully, Amy replied, and with volunteers who understand they might not survive the process. Jake looked around the room at his team and the Velkari leaders. We came here because they asked for our help. Now we know what kind of help they need. The question is whether we're willing to risk human lives to save alien children. After everything they did to us during the war, Ben said quietly, we're still going to try to save them. That's what makes us human, Jake replied. Dan White closed his eyes and tried to quiet the storm in his mind. As Dr. Amy Rodriguez attached the neural interface to his skull, the device was a mixture of human and Velkari technology, designed to create a mental bridge between his chaotic human thoughts and the ordered mind of a Velkari larva. He could feel the cold metal against his skin and the slight electrical tingle as the system activated. Remember, Dan, don't try to control your thoughts, Amy said softly. Let your mind wander wherever it wants to go. The chaos is what protects the larva from the shadow hunger. Across the room, a small Velkari child lay on a biobed surrounded by monitoring equipment. The larva was barely 3 months old, but its mind was already more developed than most human adults. Through the neural link, Dan could feel the alien child's thoughts like whispers at the edge of his consciousness. Mathematical concepts, spatial relationships, and instinctual knowledge about hive structures and biotechnology. Connection established, reported Grace Lewis from her position at the control station. She was monitoring the link between Dan and the larva, watching for signs that the shadow hunger was trying to feed. Larva's brain activity is stabilizing. This was their 3rd day of testing the protection protocol. In medical facilities across 3 Velkari star systems, human volunteers were forming mental links with alien children, using their unpredictable thought patterns as shields against an entity that fed on potential. The cost was becoming clear. Humans weren't evolved for this kind of mental strain, and several volunteers had already suffered severe neurological damage. Captain Ben Torres entered the medical facility with a grim expression on his face. We lost another volunteer on Zephyria 7, he told Amy quietly. Lieutenant Parker was protecting twin larvae when the entity made a direct assault. He managed to drive it off, but his mind couldn't handle the feedback. He's alive, but the doctors say he may never be fully conscious again. Amy felt sick. Parker had been a good man who volunteered, despite having a wife and children back on Earth. Now his family would have to live with the knowledge that he had sacrificed his mind to save alien children whose parents had once tried to destroy humanity. How Many more volunteers do we have, she asked. Not enough, Ben replied. Word is getting back to Earth about what's happening here. Families are demanding that their loved ones be recalled from this mission. The military is under pressure to end our involvement. Through the neural link, Dan suddenly tensed. His eyes snapped open and Amy could see fear in them. Something's coming, he said through gritted teeth. I can feel it at the edge of my thoughts, testing the connection. The monitors around the larva began showing increased brain activity. The young Velkari was unconscious, but its mind was active, dreams filled with complex mathematical structures and biological processes. To the shadow hunger, it would appear as a feast of potential waiting to be consumed. Dan, let your mind go wild, Amy instructed. Think about anything except what you're supposed to be thinking about. Dan's face contorted with concentration as he tried to make his thoughts as chaotic as possible. He thought about baseball games from his childhood, the taste of his grandmother's cooking, random song lyrics, and mathematical equations with wrong answers. The neural link carried this mental chaos into the connection with the larva, creating interference that made it harder for the entity to lock onto its target. Grace watched her instruments with growing alarm. The entity is pushing harder. Dan's neural activity is spiking beyond safe levels. I can hold it, Dan gasped. Through the link, he could feel something vast and hungry pressing against his mind, looking for a way to reach the larva. It was like standing in front of a black hole made of pure hunger, something that wanted to consume not just the alien child's life, but all the potential that life might have achieved. In another part of the facility, Kate Morgan was working frantically with a team of Velkari technicians to complete a new type of defense system. They had been studying the shadow hunger's feeding patterns and discovered something important. The entity followed certain rules when it hunted, almost like a natural law of predation. If we can't stop it from hunting, maybe we can turn its own nature against it. Kate explained to the Velkari scientist Tekmor. Every predator has instincts that can be exploited. We just need to find this thing's weakness. What do you propose? Tekmor asked. A trap, Kate replied. We create a false target that looks like the perfect prey but is actually designed to feed back into the entity when it tries to feed. Use its own hunger against it. The work was incredibly complex, requiring them to simulate the mental patterns of a highly developed young mind, while building in chaotic feedback loops that would activate when the entity tried to feed. They had to work quickly because across the Velkari colonies, more children were getting sick, and the human volunteers protecting them were reaching their limits. Back in the medical facility, Dan was losing his battle against the shadow hunger. The entity had adapted to his mental chaos and was finding ways to work around the interference he was creating. The larva on the biobed began to show signs of the fading sickness that had claimed so many other Velkari young. Dan's neural activity is critical, Grace reported. If he pushes any harder, he could suffer permanent brain damage. Amy faced an impossible choice. She could order Dan to break the connection and save his mind, but that would leave the larva defenseless against the entity. Or she could let him continue fighting and risk losing another volunteer to the neural feedback that had already claimed too many human minds. There's something else coming, Dan said suddenly. His voice was strained, but there was surprise in it rather than fear. Another presence, but this one feels different. On the monitors, Amy could see new patterns of brain activity from the larva. Instead of the ordered mathematical thoughts typical of Velkari minds, there were chaotic, creative patterns that looked almost human in nature. The larva is adapting to your mental patterns, Amy realized. It's learning to think like a human. The change happened quickly. As the young Velkari's mind became more chaotic and unpredictable, it became harder for the shadow hunger to feed on it. The entity retreated, confused by prey that no longer fit its understanding of how Velkari minds worked. It's working, Grace said with amazement. The larva's brain activity is stabilizing and the entity is withdrawing. But the victory came at a cost. Dan collapsed as the neural feedback hit him like a physical blow. Amy rushed to check his vital signs while Grace monitored the equipment to make sure the larva was safe. Dan's alive but unconscious, Amy reported. Neural activity is erratic but within survivable ranges. The larva appears to be unharmed and its thought patterns have stabilized in the new chaotic configuration. Ben Torres looked at the readings with a mixture of hope and concern. So we can save them by teaching them to think like humans. But how many of our people are we going to lose in the process? As many as it takes, came a voice from the doorway. Jake Morrison entered the facility, having just arrived from another colony where similar battles were taking place. I've been talking to Earth Command. They're not ordering us to withdraw, but they're not sending reinforcements either. We're on our own. Amy looked at the unconscious form of Dan White and the sleeping Velkari larva whose life he had saved. We need Kate's trap to work. If we can strike back at the entity instead of just defending against it, we might be able to end this without losing more volunteers. How close is she to finishing it? Jake asked. She thinks she can have a prototype ready in 2 days, Ben replied, but it will require someone to make direct mental contact with the entity. Not just creating interference like the volunteers have been doing, but actually linking with the thing itself. That would be suicide, Amy said. Maybe, Jake replied, but if it works, it would save thousands of Velkari, children, and prevent the entity from growing strong enough to threaten other species. He looked around the medical facility at the equipment keeping both human and alien patients alive. 30 years ago, we were killing each other. Now we're dying to protect their children. I'm not sure if that makes us heroes or fools. Maybe both, Amy said quietly. Dr. Amy Rodriguez strapped herself into the pilot seat of the modified Velkari bioship as hyperspace opened around them like a wound in reality. The ship itself was alive, grown rather than built, with walls that pulsed like a heartbeat and controls that responded to thought as much as touch. Human technology had been integrated into its living systems, creating chaos theory navigation that could follow the shadow hunger into the spaces between dimensions. Hyperspace entry complete, reported Roy Clark from the navigation station. We're following the entity's trail into whatever dimension it calls home. Around them, the interior of hyperspace looked like nothing that should exist. Colors that had no names flowed past the viewports, and geometric shapes formed and dissolved according to rules that hurt the human mind to contemplate. The Velkari bioship was equipped with biological filters that helped protect their minds from the worst effects. But Amy could still feel reality bending around them. Jake Morrison stood at the command position, his hands gripping the living metal of the ship's control interface. Behind him, 12 human volunteers and 6 Velkari technicians worked at stations throughout the bridge. Every human aboard had volunteered for what they all knew was likely a suicide mission. Contact ahead, announced Grace Lewis from the sensor station. The entity is directly in front of us, about 10,000 kilometers and closing. Through the ship's biological sensors, they could perceive the shadow hunger in its true form. It appeared as a writhing mass of darkness and hunger, formed from the consumed potential of countless civilizations. Streams of energy flowed into it from across the galaxy, the life force of young minds being drained even at this distance. Kate, is your trap ready? Jake asked. Kate Morgan looked up from the weapon station where she had been making final adjustments to their experimental device. As ready as it can be. The feedback weapon is designed to use the entity's own feeding mechanism against it, but we'll need to get it to try to feed on the trap before it realizes what we're doing. And someone needs to make direct mental contact to activate it, Amy added quietly. The plan was desperate and dangerous. They would use the bioship's neural interface to connect a human mind directly to the shadow hunger, making the person appear to be an incredibly attractive target. When the entity tried to feed, Kate's trap would activate, creating a feedback loop that would hopefully tear the creature apart from within. I'm the most expendable person here, said Chris Baker, moving toward the neural interface chair. I don't have family waiting for me back home. No, Amy said firmly. I designed the interface and I understand the entity's feeding patterns better than anyone. It has to be me. Jake started to object, but Amy was already connecting herself to the ship's living neural network. The bioship's consciousness merged with hers, giving her access to senses that no human was meant to possess. Through the ship's perception, she could feel the shadow hunger approaching like a storm of pure appetite. Amy, your neural activity is spiking, Grace reported. The entity is detecting you. Good, Amy replied, though her voice was strained. That means it's taking the bait. The shadow hunger rushed toward their ship with terrifying speed. Through the neural link, Amy could feel its attention focus on her like a searchlight made of hunger. It perceived her as a unique feast, a mature human mind filled with chaotic thoughts and creative potential. Exactly the kind of prey it had been seeking for millions of years. Contact in 30 seconds, Roy announced. Everyone hold on. Amy felt the entity's presence crash into her mind like a tidal wave. It was vast, ancient, and filled with the echoes of every civilization it had destroyed. She could hear the death screams of species whose names had been forgotten, feel the weight of potential that had been consumed across the galaxy for eons beyond counting. Now, Kate, Amy gasped as the shadow hunger began to feed on her thoughts. Kate activated the trap. Instead of Amy's real mind, the entity suddenly found itself trying to consume a carefully constructed fake consciousness filled with feedback loops and chaotic algorithms. The moment it began feeding, those loops activated, sending the entity's own hunger back into itself in an endless cycle. The effect was immediate and devastating. The shadow hunger screamed across multiple dimensions as its own nature turned against it. The massive darkness began to collapse inward, consuming itself with the same appetite it had used to destroy civilizations. But the feedback was flowing through Amy as well. She could feel her mind being torn apart by the chaotic energies as the trap did its work. The neural interface was overloading, sending feedback through the bioship's living systems and into every person connected to it. Amy's neural activity is critical, Grace shouted over the alarms. The feedback is killing her. Disconnect her from the interface, Jake ordered. I can't, Kate replied desperately. If we break the connection now, the trap will fail and the entity might escape. Amy could barely hear them through the storm in her mind. The shadow hunger was dying, but it was taking her with it. She could feel her memories being consumed. Her thoughts scattered across hyperspace like leaves in a hurricane. But she could also feel something else. The sudden silence from across the galaxy as the entity's feeding stopped, and countless young minds were freed from its influence. The entity is collapsing, Roy reported. Whatever Amy is doing, it's working. But she's dying, Grace said. In the medical facilities across 3 star systems, human volunteers who had been protecting Valkyrie larvae suddenly felt the pressure in their minds disappear. The shadow hunger's influence was gone, leaving behind confused but healthy alien children who were learning to think with the chaotic creativity their human protectors had taught them. On Zephyria Prime, Hive speaker Zexhi felt the change instantly. The constant fear that had gripped his people for months vanished like a shadow at dawn. Their young were safe, saved by the sacrifice of beings they had once considered inferior. Back in hyperspace, Amy Rodriguez made her final decision. With the last of her strength, she pushed more of her consciousness into the feedback loop, ensuring that the shadow hunger would be completely destroyed, even if it meant her own death. Amy, no, Jake called out, but it was too late. The shadow hunger collapsed into nothingness, taking with it the consumed potential of millions of years. Amy's body went still as her mind followed the entity into destruction. Her last thoughts not of victory, but of all the children, human and Valkyrie alike, who would now have a chance to grow up. The bioship dropped out of hyperspace near Zephyria Prime, its living systems damaged but functional. Jake Morrison stood over Amy's body as Grace checked for vital signs they all knew wouldn't be there. She's gone, Grace said quietly. The bridge was silent except for the soft humming of the bioship's damaged systems. Through the viewports they could see Valkyrie ships approaching, their crews ready to welcome back the humans who had saved their species. Commander Morrison, came Zexhi's voice over the communication system. Our sensors indicate the threat has ended. Dr. Rodriguez succeeded. Yes, Jake replied simply. She did. 6 months later, Jake stood in the memorial garden that had been built on Zephyria Prime to honor the humans who had died protecting Valkyrie children. Amy's name was inscribed in both human writing and Valkyrie symbols, along with the names of Dan White, Lieutenant Parker, and 15 other volunteers who had given their lives to save an alien species. Ben Torres joined him at the memorial. The joint colonies are thriving, he reported. Human and Valkyrie families living side by side, their children playing together like the war never happened. Amy would have liked that, Jake said. The Guardian Corps is officially established, Ben continued. Joint human Valkyrie teams dedicated to protecting young life throughout the galaxy. They want to use Amy's name for their motto. Jake nodded. What would it be? From the ashes of war, the shield of peace, Ben replied. They're planning to put it on every ship and every facility. In the distance, they could see a group of children playing in the garden. Half were human, half were Valkyrie, and they moved together with the easy friendship that only children can achieve. The young Velkari thought with the chaotic creativity their human protectors had taught them, while the human children had learned patience and logical thinking from their alien friends. "Do you think it was worth it?" Ben asked quietly. "Everything we sacrificed to get here." Jake watched a human girl help a young Velkari climb to the top of a play structure. "Ask me again in 50 years when those children are adults and they're the ones making decisions about war and peace." Above them, ships from both species worked together in the planet's orbit, no longer as former enemies but as partners in something larger than either could achieve alone. The greatest threat had become the strongest alliance, bound together by the memory of those who chose to protect rather than destroy. The war was over. The real work was just beginning.